The Oklahoma sky was a pale, cloudless blue, but the air in the auction yard felt heavy, not from weather, but from weariness. Dust swirled around old boots and sunburned necks as ranchers leaned against the rails, waiting for the final horse of the day. When Lot 147 entered the ring, the reaction was immediate. A collective sigh, some chuckles, and a few pitying glances. The black stallion moved with slow resistance, his head cocked slightly, a swelling visible along his right jaw. He looked fierce, but not fierce with power, fierce with pain. "Still haven't put that thing down?" Clint muttered, spitting into the dirt. He was in his 60s, wiry and sharp-eyed, with a permanent scowl that matched the deep lines around his mouth. "Should have been off the books weeks ago." Claire Whitmore stood quietly on the opposite side of the pen, away from the crowd. Her boots were worn but clean, her long braid tucked into the collar of her faded denim jacket. She wasn't there to buy anything. Since Roy died, she hadn't been anywhere with intention. Dottie, her neighbor and oldest friend, had dragged her here. "It'll do you good to get out," Dottie had said that morning, her voice as gentle as the hands that had helped deliver calves for 3 decades. "You can't stay locked up in that house with ghosts and bills forever." Claire hadn't answered then, and she didn't speak now. Not until she saw the stallion, and not just saw, but felt him. Beneath the scars and swollen jaw, there was a stillness in his eyes. Not rage, not madness, pain. A deep, quiet kind. The kind she recognized. The kind she lived with. The auctioneer's voice rang out, half-hearted. "Lot 147. Opening at 500. Do I hear 5? Nothing. 4. A few chuckles. 3. Clint shook his head and barked out, "Lady'd be better off burnin' her money." "I'll take him," Claire said, suddenly and firmly. Heads turned. Clint's eyebrows lifted. "You serious, Whitmore?" "I said I'll take him." "Sold." Lot 147. $300, the auctioneer called, shrugging. As the horse was led to the trailer, Dottie moved beside Claire. "You sure about this, honey?" she asked softly. Claire didn't answer. The wind picked up a little as the stallion looked back at her, eyes softening for just a moment. He didn't know her story. But maybe, just maybe, he recognized the brokenness in her the way she saw it in him. The drive back to the ranch was quiet, except for the occasional rattle of the trailer hitched to Claire's old Chevy. The black stallion paced nervously inside, his hooves shifting restlessly on the metal floor. Claire glanced at him through the side mirror, heart pounding harder than she cared to admit. She hadn't told Dottie, or herself, what she was going to do with the horse. She didn't have a plan. What she had was a feeling. A pull. Like something in her life had finally spoken loud enough to break through the silence of grief. Dottie sat in the passenger seat, hands folded neatly on her lap, eyes soft but worried. "Claire," she said, her voice like warm tea, "you don't need another project. You need rest. You need to heal." Claire didn't take her eyes off the road. "Maybe this is how I heal." Dottie sighed but didn't argue. She'd known Claire since they were girls. Once Claire set her mind to something, no sermon or storm could shake her loose. Back at the ranch, the sky was beginning to shift into that golden-orange hue that made everything look softer than it really was. Claire backed the trailer up to the small paddock beside the barn, the same barn Roy built by hand 20 years ago. The gate creaked as she opened it, and the stallion hesitated before stepping down. He didn't bolt, didn't rear, just walked out slow, ears twitching, as if testing the earth under him. Claire stood still, letting him come to terms with his new surroundings. She didn't reach for him. She just watched. Clint's truck pulled up uninvited, kicking up dust as it stopped near the gate. He stepped out, arms crossed, a smirk already forming. "Heard you brought home the devil's own horse," he said, voice heavy with sarcasm. You planning to ride him or let him finish rotting in your barn? Claire didn't flinch. I'm planning to see who he is when someone finally gives him a chance. Clint spat again, not in anger, in disbelief. He's gonna eat your savings alive, Whitmore. But hell, maybe you like rescuing things too far gone. As Clint drove off, Claire turned to the stallion again. He stood near the fence now, watching her, eyes darker in the fading light. You need a name, she said softly. Her fingers gripped the gate. How about Chance? The word hung in the air, quiet but full of weight. For a second, she swore he blinked in approval. She didn't know what lay ahead. But neither did he. The next morning came early, as it always did on the ranch, but Claire was already awake when the rooster crowed. Sleep had been scarce since Roy died, but this time it wasn't grief that had kept her up. It was a quiet stirring, anticipation, maybe even hope. She sipped her coffee by the window, eyes fixed on the paddock where Chance stood motionless, watching the first rays of sun stretch across the field. He hadn't made a sound all night. No kicking, no crashing. Just silence, like he was waiting for something too. Claire walked out slowly, bucket in hand, her boots crunching the frost-bitten grass. Chance lifted his head but didn't move. She set the bucket down inside the paddock, oats mixed with softened cubes, gentle on the mouth. He stepped forward cautiously, but his eyes never left hers. Claire knelt by the fence, not too close, and watched. You and me, she whispered. We're both running on borrowed time. For a long moment, the only sound was the quiet crunch of oats between aching teeth. Later that afternoon, Dottie arrived with a basket of cornbread and the kind of look that said I'm checking on you without saying I'm checking on you. Claire smiled faintly. He ate this morning. Dottie raised an eyebrow. That so? Well, that's more than Clint's been able to say about his horses lately. They both chuckled, but the laughter faded fast. Claire, Dottie said, serious now, I know you see something in him. Just don't lose yourself trying to fix something that might not want to be fixed. Claire nodded, but deep down, she didn't believe Chance was broken. Not entirely. Damaged, maybe. Like her. But still breathing. Still standing. That meant something. Over the next 3 days, they learned each other's rhythms. Claire moved slow and steady, never rushing. Chance didn't trust hands, but he started to trust presence. He allowed her to be near the fence longer. Then closer. By the 4th day, he let her touch his shoulder. Not long, but long enough to stir something deep in her chest. He was still skittish, still pulled away fast. But he always looked back. On the 5th morning, Claire called the vet, a quiet middle-aged man named Dr. Morgan who'd once stitched up Roy after a bull pinned him. He arrived with a tranquilizer and a gentleness that matched Claire's energy. The infection was worse than she feared. Several abscesses, deep-rooted, painful. This been neglected a long time, he said, removing fragments of rotting tooth. Claire watched, jaw tight, heart aching. She had expected pain. She hadn't expected guilt. As Chance trembled under sedation, Claire knelt beside him, her hand resting gently on his neck. I'm sorry, she whispered. No one saw what was hurting you. But I do now. The days that followed the vet's visit were quiet but heavy. Chance spent most of his time standing in the far corner of the paddock, his energy drained from the procedure. Claire watched him from the porch, wrapped in Roy's old flannel jacket, nursing a cup of coffee she kept refilling just to feel the warmth in her hands. The barnyard was still, except for the creak of the gate in the wind and the occasional call of a mourning dove somewhere out in the trees. It was the kind of silence that demanded reflection, the kind Claire had been avoiding for months. She kept busy tending to Chance's recovery, mixing his food softer, adding herbs Dottie swore by. She cleaned the wound site carefully, her hands steady despite the way her chest clenched every time he flinched. Claire spoke to him often now. About the weather, about Roy, about how hard it was to sleep alone in a bed that used to hold 2 lives. She wasn't sure if it helped him, but it helped her. And for the first time in a long while, the ranch didn't feel quite so empty. But the town had taken notice. At the feed store, she overheard whispers. Poor Claire, still not right since Roy passed. Spent her money on a horse no one wanted. She's gonna lose that ranch trying to save something she can't. Clint's voice stood out the loudest. Of course, it always did. That horse'll be the death of her, mark my words. Claire didn't respond. She just paid for her supplies and walked out, shoulders high, but her jaw tight the whole way home. That evening, she found herself standing by the fence line just before sunset, the sky streaked in gold and lavender. Chance walked slowly toward her, still cautious but more present now. His eyes no longer darted at every sound. They stayed on her. When he stopped a few feet away, she reached out. This time, he didn't pull back. Her fingers brushed his cheek gently, right where the swelling had once been. "You're healing," she said quietly. "One slow day at a time." Behind her, the screen door creaked open. Dottie stepped out, arms crossed, eyes on the horizon. "He's changing," she said. Claire nodded. "So am I." But later that night, as Claire folded laundry in the dim light of the living room, she opened a drawer she hadn't touched in months. Roy's pocketknife was still there, along with a letter she never finished reading, addressed to her, dated just days before his accident. And as her eyes traced the familiar handwriting, something in her heart shifted, a question forming like a storm in the distance. Claire stared at the letter for a long time before unfolding it. The paper was yellowed at the edges, the ink slightly faded, but Roy's handwriting was as clear as if he'd written it that morning. Her fingers trembled, unsure if she was ready for what it might say. She sat down on the edge of the bed, the room dim except for the small lamp on the nightstand. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, and in the distance, she could hear Chance pacing in the paddock. The letter began simply, like Roy always spoke. No poetry, just truth. He wrote about the debts piling up, about how he'd taken out a loan without telling her, hoping to fix the irrigation system before the drought got worse. But the money never made it that far. "Claire," the letter read, "I made a mistake. And I didn't want to leave this world with you thinking I didn't trust you. I was ashamed." Claire's heart clenched. The pain she had buried for months now surfaced with a weight she hadn't prepared for. She hadn't just lost Roy, she had inherited his silence. The next morning, she fed Chance with a fog hanging over her mind. Her movements were mechanical, distracted. Chance noticed. He stood closer to her than usual, head lowered, breathing calmly. When she stepped into the paddock, he didn't flinch. He nudged her arm softly, and for the first time, she let herself lean into him. The horse who once wouldn't be touched now held her weight like an anchor. She whispered, "We've both been lied to, haven't we?" and felt the tears rise before she could stop them. Later, Dottie stopped by and found Claire sitting in the barn beside Chance, silent and distant. "Something's wrong," Dottie said, crouching beside her. Claire handed her the letter. Dottie read it in silence, lips tight. When she finished, she looked at Claire with something like sorrow, but also something like relief. "You didn't fail him," she said softly. "He just didn't know how to carry his burden, and he didn't want to put it on you." That night, Claire couldn't sleep. The wind was louder now, or maybe it just felt that way. She stood at the window, watching the moonlight fall across the paddock. Chance stood at the gate, staring at the house. Like he was waiting. Or guarding. Maybe both. And in that moment, Claire knew, if she was going to save the ranch and herself, it wasn't just about healing Chance, it was about facing everything Roy left behind. The next few days brought rain, the cold, steady kind that soaked the ground and turned the paddock into thick, clinging mud. Claire worked through it anyway, her coat heavy with water, her boots sinking with each step. She checked Chance's mouth daily, careful not to disturb the healing, careful not to let the storm inside her spill out. The letter stayed on the kitchen table, unfolded now, as if its presence alone demanded action. The bank had called again. Claire let it go to voicemail. The voice on the other end was polite but firm. 3 months behind, and no more extensions. The thought of losing the ranch, of letting Roy's legacy slip through her fingers, made her chest tighten. And yet, something in her resisted panic. Not because she had a plan, but because, for the first time since Roy's death, she wasn't facing it alone. Chance had become more than a project. He was a quiet presence that made each heavy moment feel less isolating. Clint stopped by during a break in the rain, uninvited as always. He leaned against the fence, arms crossed, a cigarette burning between his fingers. "Heard about the bank," he said bluntly. "You know, you could sell that horse. Might fetch a little now that he's not limping." Claire didn't even look at him. "He's not for sale." Clint scoffed. "Pride's a funny thing, Claire. Can't buy feed with it. Can't pay a mortgage with it either." She turned slowly, eyes steady. "This isn't about pride. It's about choosing what I believe in, even if no one else does." Clint shook his head, flicked the ash into the mud, and walked off. But his words clung to her like the wet air. She knew he wasn't entirely wrong. The ranch needed money. She needed help. And saving a horse wouldn't stop foreclosure. That night, as the rain softened to mist, Claire went out to the barn. Chance stood quietly in his stall, ears flicking when he saw her. She opened the gate and stepped inside without hesitation. He didn't move. She ran her hand along his neck, feeling the strength returning to his frame. "You're getting better," she whispered. "But I'm running out of time." In that quiet barn, surrounded by the echoes of choices, hers and Roy's, Claire made a silent vow. She wouldn't give up the ranch without a fight. And she wouldn't abandon the one creature who looked at her like she still had something worth holding on to. The next morning, Claire woke before the sun. The sky was still navy blue when she stepped onto the porch, the air crisp, carrying the scent of wet soil and distant pine. The ranch was silent, but her mind wasn't. Something inside her had shifted. The fear was still there, yes, but it had a new companion, resolve. She wasn't ready to let go. Not of the ranch. Not of Chance. And not of the part of herself that Roy had once believed in, even when she didn't. She pulled on her jacket and went straight to the barn. Chance lifted his head at the sound of her boots, his ears twitching. His coat had regained its shine, and the infection had almost completely healed. He looked stronger now. Whole. Claire opened the stall and walked in slowly, holding a worn halter in her hand. "We've waited long enough," she said quietly. "Let's see what you remember." She didn't rush. Her movements were patient, deliberate. When she slipped the halter over his head, he flinched, but didn't resist. That alone felt like a victory. Out in the paddock, she led him in slow circles. His steps were uncertain, like muscle memory long forgotten. But there was no panic in his eyes, only curiosity. She talked to him the entire time, like Roy used to do when training colts. "You're not broken," she said softly. "Just waiting for someone to believe that." As the wind picked up, lifting the edge of her hat, Claire smiled for the first time in days. Small, but real. That afternoon, she drove into town with a folder in the passenger seat, bank documents, loan information, and a copy of Roy's unsigned letter. She parked outside the local credit union and sat in the truck for several minutes before finally stepping inside. The manager, Mr. Talley, knew her by name. Knew Roy, too. "Claire," he said, surprised. "Wasn't expecting you." She placed the folder on his desk. "I need help. But I also need you to know the truth about what Roy tried to keep hidden." Meanwhile, back at the ranch, Dottie arrived to check on things. She found Chance standing by the gate, calm, alert. He didn't shy away when she approached. In fact, he nudged her shoulder gently. "Well, I'll be," she whispered, running her hand along his muzzle. "You're becoming something else, aren't you, boy?" As the sun dipped low and painted the sky in amber, Claire stepped out of the bank with a different look in her eyes. Not victory, not defeat, but determination. She had bought herself time. Maybe not much, but enough. The week began with an unseasonal warmth. The air was heavy, still, and the skies too clear, as if the world itself was holding something back. Claire felt it in her chest, like a pressure that wouldn't lift. Since her meeting at the bank, she had bought herself some time, but not peace. The whispers in town hadn't faded. Some people pitied her, others called her reckless. But she stayed the course. Every morning she worked the land, tended to Chance, and did what she could to keep the weight of it all from crushing her. That morning, while brushing an old saddle Roy once used, she noticed a car climbing the long dirt road toward the house. It wasn't one she recognized. She wiped her hands and stepped out onto the porch as a tall man in a wrinkled dress shirt stepped out. His face looked older, worn by time, but still familiar. It was Eli Carter, Roy's former lawyer and longtime friend of the family. Claire hadn't seen him since the funeral, and even then, he'd seemed uncomfortable, like he was holding something back. "Claire," he said, his voice low, "I need to talk to you. It's long overdue." She led him inside, where he placed a thick envelope on the kitchen table. "Roy gave me this just 2 days before the accident. Told me to deliver it only if something happened to him." Claire's fingers hesitated over the envelope, her heart pounding. "There's another letter?" she asked. Eli nodded. "And something else, a signed draft contract. Roy was planning to sell part of the land, the North Field." Her stomach turned. The North Field. The same field where Roy had proposed to her under a sky full of stars. It wasn't just land, it was memory, sacred and personal. She opened the envelope and found Roy's signature at the bottom of a real estate agreement. The deal hadn't gone through, but the intent was clear. "Why didn't he tell me?" she whispered. Eli didn't answer right away. "He was afraid, Claire. Of losing everything. Of failing you. He didn't know how to ask for help." After Eli left, Claire walked to the edge of the North Field. The sun was setting, casting gold across the tall grass. Chance stood nearby, calm and alert. As she approached, he moved toward her without hesitation. She pressed her forehead gently against his, eyes closed. "He almost gave this away," she whispered. "And I never knew." In that moment, Claire knew this wasn't just about Roy's secret. It was about truth, and who she would choose to be now that she knew it. The lies were no longer hers to protect. They never had been. The next morning came with a restless wind. The sky was overcast, and the land seemed to hold its breath. Claire stood at the edge of the North Field, boots sinking slightly in the damp soil. She stared at the hills that Roy almost sold, the place that held some of her most sacred memories. That betrayal, even if born from fear or desperation, had carved a deep mark. And yet, instead of bitterness, what rose inside her now was clarity. She had spent too long letting silence speak for her. That would end today. She drove into town in her old Chevy, not to hide, but to speak. First stop was the feed store, the unofficial town square. Clint was there, as usual, leaning against a shelf near the register, talking like he owned the place. When Claire walked in, the chatter faded. Heads turned. Some offered polite nods. Clint raised an eyebrow. "Well, look who's back. Thought you might have sold that ghost horse by now." Claire walked straight up to him. "I'm tired of people talking about me like I'm not standing right here." Her voice was calm, but it carried weight. I didn't come here for your advice, Clint, or your approval. Roy made mistakes. So have I. But I'm not hiding behind silence anymore. Clint blinked, unsure what to say for once. Behind him, Dottie had just walked in and caught the end of Claire's words. She smiled, proud. Claire continued, now turning to the room. That horse, his name is Chance. He's not just a rescue. He's a reflection of pain, of healing, of not being thrown away when you're no longer perfect. The room remained silent, but not in mockery, in attention. After leaving the store, Claire made her way to the local community board near the courthouse. She pinned a note up herself, Whitmore Ranch, offering beginner riding lessons, horse care education, and therapy sessions with rescued horses. Starting next month. Below it, she added her number and the simple line, "Come meet Chance." Back home, as evening settled in, Claire found Chance waiting near the fence again. She approached slowly, her body tired, but her spirit lighter. He leaned into her touch, eyes soft, grounded. For the first time since Roy's death, she didn't feel like she was just surviving. She was building something new. And in the distance, across the land Roy nearly sold, the wind carried the promise of a different kind of tomorrow, not one shaped by fear, but by truth. 1 month later, the ranch looked different, not because of any major renovation, but because it breathed again. Kids' laughter echoed across the paddock as they took turns brushing Chance, now fully recovered, his coat gleaming in the early spring light. Claire stood at the gate, clipboard in hand, watching with a quiet smile. She'd done it. Not everything was solved, the bills still came, and there were still tough mornings, but something had changed. The ranch had a heartbeat again. She'd opened her gates not just to horses, but to people. The community had begun to respond. A single mom brought her son, who rarely spoke, to see the gentle black horse. A veteran with shaking hands came just to sit on the porch and watch the animals. Each visitor, in their own way, found a piece of healing here, and Chance, the horse no one wanted, became the center of it all. He didn't need to run or be ridden. He just needed to be. Dottie watched it all from the rocking chair Claire had fixed up just for her, a thermos of sweet tea in her lap. "I knew you had more in you than grief," she said, her voice proud but gentle. Claire nodded. "I just needed to lose everything, to remember what was really mine." She looked out across the field Roy once tried to sell, now fenced and thriving, with wildflowers starting to return. It was no longer just land, it was legacy, and she was finally living it on her own terms. One afternoon, Clint stopped by. He didn't have much to say at first. Just stood by the fence, arms crossed, watching Chance rest his head against a little girl's shoulder. "He's not what I thought," he finally said. Claire chuckled. "Neither am I." Clint nodded, then tipped his hat and left. That was all. But it was enough. That night, Claire sat on the porch alone, a blanket over her lap and Chance grazing peacefully nearby. She pulled Roy's second letter from her pocket, the one she had finally finished reading. There were regrets in his words, but also love, and an unspoken wish that she find her own way, even without him. She folded it gently, placed it back in the envelope, and whispered, "I have, Roy. I really have." As the stars blinked to life above her, Claire closed her eyes and listened, not to the silence of loss, but to the quiet fullness of a life rebuilt. The horse no one wanted had given her everything she forgot she had. And this time, she was never letting go.